March, 1941. Man's dealings with women can be purely physical. They cannot really, of course, but I mean he can refuse to take other things into account, to the great damage of his soul and body and theirs. Or friendly, or he can be a lover, engaging and blending all his affections and powers of mind and body in a complex emotion powerfully colored and energized by sex. This is a fallen world. The dislocation of sex instinct is one of the chief symptoms of the fall. The world has been going to the bad all down the ages. Various social forms shift, and each new mode has its special dangers. But the hard spirit of concupiscence has walked down every street and sat leering in every house since Adam fell. We will leave aside the immoral results. These you desire not to be dragged into. To renunciation you have no call. Friendship, then? In this fallen world, the friendship that should be possible between all human beings is virtually impossible between man and woman. The devil is endlessly ingenious, and sex is his favorite subject. He is as good every bit at catching you through generous, romantic, or tender motives as through baser or more animal ones. This friendship has often been tried. One side or the other nearly always fails. Later in life, when sex cools down, it may be possible. It may happen between saints. To ordinary folk, it can only rarely occur. Two minds that have really a primarily mental and spiritual affinity may by accident reside in a male and a female body, and yet may desire and achieve a friendship quite independent of sex. But no one can count on it. The other partner will let him or her down, almost certainly by falling in love. But a young man does not really, as a rule, want friendship, even if he says he does. There are plenty of young men, as a rule. He wants love, innocent, and yet irresponsible, perhaps. Alas, alas, that ever a love was sinna, as Chaucer says. Then, if he is a Christian, and is aware that there is such a thing as sin, he wants to know what to do about it. Welcome. I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. What would you do if you got a letter like that from your dad at 21? So this is a famous letter, letter 43, written by Professor Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, Ronald Tolkien, dad, to his son Michael in March 1941. Upon finding out that Michael had plans to get married, he'd fallen in love with his nurse. It's the war, right? And Joan Griffiths had been nursing him. 3 weeks after his 21st birthday, he writes to his parents and says that they want to get married. Tolkien brushes off this draft. I'm a little unclear whether it was ever sent, and whether from later conversations or a second letter. There's also a second letter that doesn't seem to be in the collection. The June 1941. In any case, they didn't. The kids got married. Michael and Joan got married in November 1941 and didn't invite their parents. Was Tolkien right in his concerns? More to the point, was Tolkien a terrible misogynist? This is I wanted to spend an episode talking just about this letter because it's the one that invariably, when we get to this point in my campus course, things get a little heated, right? It's like we've done okay typically in the conversations dealing potentially with Eowyn, potentially with Galadriel, maybe with Arwen, but there's always this lingering anxiety on the part of, to be fair, both the men and the women in the class, that Tolkien's really deep down doesn't really understand women terrifically well. And then they read this letter, and it probably put a little strongly to say all hell breaks loose, but something breaks loose, and they're really rather troubled right now. One of the interesting things that then I talk about is the effects of reading Tolkien over the course of your life, right? Many people, many people, not everybody, and many people are confessing to me that they're just now starting to read The Lord of the Rings, even though they've seen the movies or even though they're all grown up. But many people read The Lord of the Rings for the first time when they're young, adolescents, right? 11, 12, 13 seems to be a typical age. You might grow up with an older sister or brother, your parents maybe giving you the book, but when I read it, I'm pretty sure I was 11 or 12, and just on the edge of, wanting the story to have sex in it. Kind of disappointed that these tense scenes that we get between Eowyn and Aragorn, or the grand love affair between Aragorn and Arwen, is not more fully realized on page, even though for Aragorn and Arwen, they definitely have sex because they end up with a child, and he succeeds his father as king. There's lots and lots of sex going on behind the scenes if you count up all the children, particularly in the appendices with all of the genealogies and so forth, right? But there's not very much actually in the story itself. Now you might say there's rather a lot more potentially in the Silmarillion, particularly the Stirring Baron of Luthien, which I'm just going to keep promising you that we're going to talk about. We're still working up to being able to understand why it's the centerpiece of Tolkien's compositions. But say maybe the story of Turin, then that's even worse, because he ends up marrying his sister, and then they both, when they wake up from the dragon spell that they've both been under and realize the incest that they've committed, she flings herself off a cliff and he kills the dragon and dies. I can't remember. We also are going to need to talk about Turin. It's simply not true that Tolkien in his literature, I don't say fiction, right? It's storytelling. In his storytelling, didn't deal with sex on a fairly robust basis, but he certainly wasn't writing what we would now recognize as, I don't know, something like James Joyce's Ulysses with Molly Bloom and her meditation, which I realize I haven't reread since I read it in grad school, and I don't really remember what she's musing on, but I hear it's kind of dirty, right? It's interesting that, I think one of the reasons that modern readers consider Tolkien so, sort of fuddy-duddy and not modern, is that he doesn't have the porn on the page, as it were. He doesn't put the actual lovemaking, the sex scenes in any detail in his stories, and so there's always this sort of weird kind of assumption that he never had sex. Well, he had 4 children, and his own love story, which he recounts sort of in brief at the end of this letter, was rather steamy on its own, right? And if I alluded to some of this last time, talking about Edith as his Luthien, right? Well, that they were both orphans, and they were both living in a boarding house in Birmingham, and they met when she was 19 and he was only 16, and they, some of this you can get off the Wikipedia entry, which is all cribbed off of Humphrey Carpenter's biography, which apparently has, there's more backstory than Carpenter put in his narrative, which now that Christopher's died may be coming out, but anyway, and I'm not sure, having resisted seeing the 2019 movie, whether how much of this got in the movie, but they fall in love, which is the setting of the movie, right? The setting of the biopic, that they're that age that they're both at. But because Tolkien is so young, when his guardian, Father Francis Xavier Morgan, found out about, as they would have said at the time, their attachment, he forbid Tolkien from seeing Edith anymore. She moves to oh golly, now I've forgotten, Chelmsford or Cheltenham, where was she? Now I can't remember. I'm sorry. I thought I'd gotten all my details down for you. She moves away, and he's supposed to be, engaged in his studies. And as he comments in letter 43, he muffed his exams, right? And so he didn't get a very good, as he would say, an exhibition of £60, but a scholarship, right? He doesn't get a very good scholarship to attend college, and he really needed it because he's an orphan and he doesn't have money, and so he should have been studying harder. And Father Morgan was to a certain extent concerned that he was distracting himself with playing with Edith, but as a priest, presumably also concerned with Tolkien's soul, because Edith, when Tolkien met her, when Ronald and Edith met, was not Catholic, right? She was Anglican. And again, I as I understand it, this doesn't show up in the biopic. I guess I'm gonna have to watch that, aren't I, just for like research purposes. But the Christian reviewers that I read said that this was completely left out, which is of course a major element in the way in which Tolkien himself talks about their relationship, because your mother was older than I, he tells Michael, and not a Catholic, altogether unfortunate as viewed by a guardian. And it was, in a sense, very unfortunate, in a way very bad for me. And as I said, these things are absorbing and nervously exhausting. Falling in love can be like that. And his guardian wasn't going to let him be betrothed to someone who wasn't Catholic, and he wasn't going to let Tolkien make any kind of promises before he reached the age of majority at 21, right? So Edith moves away. Tolkien, buckles down fairly well in his studies. They don't see each other for 3 years until, as he says, on the night of my 21st birthday, I wrote again to your mother. January 3rd, 1913. On January 8th, I went back to her and became engaged and informed an astonished family. You really want to have seen that scene, right? When he shows up and he writes a letter to her saying, I'm now 21. Will you marry me? She was at the time engaged to somebody else and to an Anglican, right? And her, the landlord of the boarding house where she was living at that point was also Anglican, and threw her out when he found out she was marrying a Catholic and converting. And Tolkien wouldn't, in fact, marry her until she converted, and so it took another year before they could get married. It took a bit longer. They don't get married until March 22nd, 1916. So there was considerable delays between meeting the woman that he spent the rest of his life with and being able to get married. And so when Tolkien is writing to Michael, and obviously it shows up in the letter, all of these sorts of layers and frustrations are obviously there, because he's writing to Michael very soon after Michael has just turned 21 and trying to caution him about flinging himself into an attachment or an engagement too soon. Well, that's ironic, since he's writing to his son, the child of the woman whom he had courted in the sort of exuberant and hot-headed way that he's trying to keep Michael and Joan from pursuing. So is this just hypocritical on Tolkien's part? Does he know what he's talking about? Is there, this is where the problem with Carpenter's biography comes in. Is it true that Edith basically resented their marriage and spent most of their time together bitter about it? Well, it does seem that she was not necessarily terrifically comfortable with the Catholicism that she got herself flung into by way of marrying Ronald, although she does seem to have very much enjoyed the children. So possibly, and contraception was a sort of, although it comes up in the letter, we'll get to that, a different sort of issue before the pill, and therefore before Humanae Vitae is an encyclical. But she was, and what Carpenter suggests is she was even more resentful of Tolkien's friendships with particularly C.S. Lewis and the other men in his community, right, the intellectuals. And that possibly seems to feed into this letter. Now, recognize Tolkien and Edith got married, Ronald and Edith got married in 1916, and Dad is writing this letter in 1941, so by this point, Michael is 21. He was born in 1920, right? So he's the second of the three sons, and there's John, who's born in 1917, so basically the honeymoon baby, born the next year after Tolkien and Edith got married. 1920, Michael is born, and so he's getting this letter for his 21st birthday, as it were. Christopher Tolkien's born in 1924, and then their sister Priscilla is born in 1929, so they're spread out over a good 12 years. And I guess when Tolkien's writing this letter, Priscilla's still quite young, right? She'd be like 12, right? So exactly how much do we consider Tolkien understands about women and men and romance and relationships, and what would, what does he mean by casting everything in this rather gloomy condition of the fall? Well, let's read this letter fairly closely. It's actually basically the first 4 pages that I wanted to read through carefully with you, because I mean, one, Tolkien is clearly writing, although it's written over the course of a couple days, 6 to 8 March. He's still writing at a fair degree of, anxiety and getting everything down on the page very, very quickly. And yet, he says some. I guess it's like because he's in this sort of unguarded moment of concern for Michael, he is giving you this blunt, very, very blunt impression that he has about what it's like being a man, deeply in love, and what that means, and his perception of the way women fall in love and what they want. I mean, you'll understand, I think, as we go through this, why the women students may get a little upset with him. But I sort of challenge you as you're listening to say, is he romanticizing the whole situation, on whose part, right? And it's like, if I could do a poll, if we're doing this as a live stream, which I understand Unauthorized is going to be starting to be able to have in the future, right? I could say, who do you, if you were to think about it, who do you think Tolkien would say tended to be more romantic, women or men? Or say romantic in the sense of unrealistic, starry-eyed, right? Is it women who are, making Prince Charmings out of the men, and the men just want to be practical and buckle down and work? Women making themselves up, as it were, and trying to capture a man with their wiles, right? Or is it the men who are more starry-eyed and incapable of making good decisions? Well, the opening thing he says is, of course, that this is a fallen world, and so none of the relations that women and men have are what they were meant to be, ideally, right? And that he's not even sure how to open it, right? Men's dealing with women can be purely physical or friendly, or he can be a lover, right? It's complicated, and he's saying, Satan makes sure, the enemy makes sure that it's always about sex, right? Did he say that in the passage that I read? The devil, yes. The devil is endlessly ingenious, and sex is his favorite subject. That no matter, sort of Tolkien starting with this, like, remember, by this time he's the father of 4 children. He's been married for 23 years, 24 years, yes, 25 years. He's been married for 25 years. He clearly has, life experience in these kinds of relationships, and to my knowledge, there, it would have been sort of unthinkable for he and Edith to consider getting divorced, in that time. I mean, it did happen, obviously, but is he just going to be pessimistic and say, don't do it? It's all misery. You shouldn't try. Well, yes, not quite, right? He is trying to make sure Michael kind of slows down and considers whether or not he should plunge himself in. But the problem that, as Tolkien sets it up, is there's too many different kinds of relationships that men and women can have, but there's one that they definitely utterly fail at constantly, and that's being friends, right? It's very, very interesting. You consider, what Carpenter claims was the case for Edith, was that she was resentful of his male friendships, or resentful of his relationships with fellow academics that she tended to feel left out of. And but it's some borne out by when they're older and he's retired, they move to one of these seaside resorts where he can be a famous author and she can be a sort of society lady, and she was actually fairly happy there. They did move. He does move back to Oxford later, and I realize yet again I've forgotten what the actual chronology is. I'm sorry. You're gonna have to look all of that up. the problem being, he has a lot of experience right now, but the thing that he doesn't think that women can be with men as friends, which you could say sounds amazingly bitter, right? That there's, you might, and the thing is, he's not actually making it impossible for men and women to be friends, but it's just rare, right? You could have, to ordinary folk, it can only rarely occur. Two minds that have a really primarily mental and spiritual affinity, maybe by accident, reside in a male and female body, but one or the other of them is going to fall in love and let them down. And so, as far as Tolkien's concerned, the falling in love destroys the friendship. That you can have this mental and spiritual affinity, but falling in love wrecks it. Remember what I told you in the last episode, that everything that Tolkien says about the elves is really about his struggling with this understanding of what it means to fall in love. And when I was prepping for this episode, I was thinking, should I tell you all about the elves? It's like, you must keep all of this in mind when we go back to the elves, to say he's considered that his ideal, it sounds like almost, is to have that mental and spiritual affinity and be irrelevant whether they're male or female, but he doesn't think it actually it happens. And besides, as a young man, he says, does not really as a rule want friendship. He wants love. Well, what's that? Right? What does Tolkien think is love? Well, let's carry on. There is in our Western culture the romantic chivalric tradition, still strong, though as a product of Christendom, yet by no means the same as Christian ethics. The times are inimical to it. Oh, wait. Love. The times are inimical to love. Though as a product, the times are inimical to the romantic chivalric tradition, but insofar as it's a product of Christendom, times are inimical to it. Already in 1941, if you guys want the sort of traditional chivalric relationship, as far as Tolkien was concerned, that was already a problem, which obviously is one of the things that appeals to those of us who love his work in the sense of creating a particular kind of relationship between the sexes, which feels fairly ideal. He wants it to be ideal. Maybe, does he? Right? But is worried, even in 1941, even at the time when he's writing the Lord of the Rings, whether or not anyone can live out this romantic chivalric understanding. Because, and there's sort of layers of the problem here, it idealizes love, and as far as it can go, can be very good, since it takes in far more than physical pleasure and enjoins, if not purity, at least fidelity, and so self-denial, service, courtesy, honor, and courage. Its weakness, of course, is that it began as an artificial courtly game, a way of enjoying love for its own sake without reference to, and indeed contrary to, matrimony. Its center was not God, but imaginary deities, love and the lady. It still tends to make the lady a kind of guiding star or divinity of the old-fashioned, his divinity, the woman he loves, the object or reason of noble conduct. This is, of course, false and at best make-believe. The woman is another fallen human being with a soul in peril, but combined and harmonized with religion, as long ago it was, producing much of that beautiful devotion to Our Lady that has been God's way of refining so much of our gross manly natures and emotions, and also of warming and coloring our hard, bitter religion. It can be very noble. Then it produces what I suppose is still felt among those who retain even vestigiary Christianity to be the highest ideal of love between man and woman. Yet I still think it has dangers. It is not wholly true and is not perfectly theocentric. Don't worry, I'm going to unpack all this. Let's get to the end of the paragraph. It takes, or at any rate has in the past taken, the young man's eyes off women as they are, as companions in shipwreck, not guiding stars. One result is for observation of the actual to make the young man turn cynical, to forget their desires, needs, and temptations. It inculcates exaggerated notions of true love as a fire from without, a permanent exaltation, unrelated to age, childbearing, and plain life, and unrelated to will and purpose. One result of that is to make young folk look for a love that will keep them always nice and warm in a cold world without any effort of theirs. And the incurably romantic go on looking even in the squalor of the divorce courts. Well, bang, 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 bang. trust me, there's a few more paragraphs to go, right? But that's paragraph 1. We've done 2 paragraphs now. We'll have 3, 4, 5, 6 to get to the full, sort of horror of this meditation. Okay, so he's saying in the Western tradition, there is such a thing as this chivalric romantic tradition, which idealizes love, and that can be a good thing, right? Because it has these virtues attached to it, right? Purity, well, maybe not purity, but fidelity, courtesy, service, honor, and courage, right? So if you think about chivalry, and this, if you know my 3 Cheers for White Men, is where I got in trouble. the beginning of my entree into the culture wars. Saying 3 Cheers for White Men, the top one being chivalry, with the idea that the chivalric code, such as it existed even, as an ideal, placed certain obligations on men to behave well towards women, to behave with, service, courtesy, honor, and courage. And, that, as Tolkien rightly points out, was bound up with ideals of Christian service. The example that I used in my blog post about this was taken from the prose Lancelot of the Lake, where the Lady of the Lake girds Lancelot with his knightly equipment, right? And it's all allegorized so that it's about his faith and serving to protect the weak, widows and orphans and poor and so forth, and to defend the Holy Church and so forth. That insofar as this chivalric courtly love, and they're it blends and is confusing because the story tradition is actually fairly complicated, does at least set up some kind of behavioral claim, for the lovers, right? That they should behave well towards each other, at least. But, and this is what's part of the scholarly sort of debate, is whether what Tolkien says in the next sentence is actually true, that it began as this artificially courtly game, contrary to matrimony, right? That what courtly love was never in fact about being married. It was about taking the lady of the court as your goddess, as it were. And as Tolkien says, it centers not God, but these imaginary deities, the woman he loves, right? And you put her up on the pedestal, and that woman up on the pedestal is problematic because she's to a certain extent in place of God, but that she is herself, because in the sort of classic stereotype of the situation, the wife of the Lord, that the squire or the troubadour or the younger knight is in love with, and so he projecting his love onto her, even if, for example, she's gotten married young, and so they're basically the same age, which then creates problems in, for example, Tristan and Isolde, where she's, at least is that true in Tristan and Isolde? She's cheating on Mark. I think that's one of the main stories that creates this image of, well, chivalric courtly love is about cheating, right? The problem is there are earlier stories, for example, Chrétien de Troyes, that are in fact about marital fidelity. Eric and Enid is a test. Eric is testing Enid in her, obedience and good service as wife. Or, Lancelot going crazy is because he doesn't serve his wife Elaine. I'm still reading John C. Wright's Green Knight's Squire, and Igraine is the mom in that, right? So Elaine, well, he goes nuts because he's in love with Guinevere instead. That they're in, across the tradition of these Arthurian romances and knightly pursuit of ladies, plenty of examples of the main characters focusing on their wives, right? Parsifal, for example, has this moment when he's thinking about his wife and missing her and sees 3 drops of blood in the snow. So the stereotype's wrong, and the sort of premise of the complication is therefore to a certain extent wrong, because Chrétien, whose name is therefore Christian, but who may have he may have been a convert. One of my students has been working on that as a question, right? So there's complicated layers in this, but it's always very intimately bound up with Christendom. And as Tolkien also points to, it's also intimately bound up with devotion to Mary, He's saying devotion to Our Lady, that's been God's way of refining so much of our gross manly natures and emotions, but also of warming and coloring our hard, bitter religion. I mean, it's interesting. He's talking about Christianity as this hard and bitter practice, and the only thing that makes it, sort of warm is devotion to Mary. Now, in my own scholarship, I've talked a lot about the devotion to Mary. I've talked about the love language that develops around describing Mary, particularly in my first book, From Judgment to Passion, the Song of Songs, the use of the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon in the liturgy for Mary, which is all love language, right? And things like the intimate head to toe descriptions of the lady that become typical in chivalric romances are most likely modeled on descriptions of wisdom in the Old Testament, right, which are then applied to Mary. So the Marian imagery is very, very strong throughout this love language, right? Both the Song of Songs and Ecclesiasticus and Proverbs, with their descriptions of Lady Wisdom as it's a beautiful figure. If you read the Song of Songs, you'll figure out that these chivalric poets are definitely reading the Bible. So the sort of Christian element in it is far more complicated than even Tolkien is suggesting in his already very complicated. Well, on the one hand, it's too idealized, but on the other hand, it wasn't actually an ideal because it was bound up in, the thing is, it's bound up in actual tests of how to be a good lover, right? So that makes the literature complicated. And then it's bound up with devotional concerns to Mary, and then that's bound up with, well, exactly what is the character of Christianity in the first place. And then, Tolkien, you're just going to throw everything at the wall right here, saying, well, but, it's not perfectly theocentric, so this ideal is in fact completely Christian. One, we realize that Tolkien himself is moderately sort of confused in terms of which ideal he wants to anchor himself to, and he's quite poignantly going to be insisting over and over again that one of the bad things that it does, this romantic chivalric courtly Christian tradition, whatever it is, right? It's a very complicated cultural construction, right? One of the worst things that it does, Tolkien is claiming here, is it takes young man's eyes off women as they are, as companions in shipwreck, not guiding stars. Now, it's very interesting that Tolkien would use that particular image, shipwreck. The women and men in his experience, and this is actually going to be a proper Christian understanding eventually. He is working with a proper Christian understanding, because men and women are fallen together, right? And that women are not these idealization, they shouldn't be these stars, these guiding stars. Well, there he's clearly drawing on a very Marian image. Right? She's the star of the sea, right? Ave Maris Stella, right? The great medieval hymn to Mary takes her as the guide, right? And there's a very, very famous sermon by Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the four sermons that he writes for the Feast of the Annunciation, where he describes Mary as the one to whom you pray, right? It's like if you ever find yourself in distress, look to Mary, look to the star. And here, I'm sure some of you are Catholic know it because it's such a famous passage as a description of the way, if you're ever lost and tossed about on the sea, and the image is very, very nautical, which you recognize is always appropriate for Tolkien because he's always tending to his Arundel as mariner imagery, right? And Arundel is the evening star, the guiding star, the morning star, the Silmarillion, right? And right now, in the midst of trying to, prevent his son from making a terrible mistake about projecting onto this woman whom he's met in the hospital, I think it's his nurse, um, saying she's not the star you think she is, right? She's down here on Earth with you. Don't turn her into this fantasy. Now that that's moderately rich coming from someone who spent his life writing fantasies about the guiding star, Arundel, right? But and claiming, of course, that his devotion in this moment is through Mary, Our Lady, right? Who is the one who makes his own faith, our hard, bitter religion, a little warmer, right? So it's complicated, right? And but it gets more so because what he's trying to do is convince. I mean, it's interesting. It's not clear from the letter whether he'd actually talked to Michael. And it's, as I understand it, from I believe Michael and Joan stay married. They do have children, and right. Okay, I forgot to double check that. Every one of these episodes I get worse and worse because I keep thinking, oh, I should have looked that up for you, because in fact, it's nice that I'm reaching my own edge in my practiced speaking on some of these topics. It's like I've never in my class been able to go through the letter at this level of granularity, and I'm really enjoying it. So thank you for listening. In any case, what Tolkien is trying to do is prevent Michael from making this mistake that he's projecting onto him, which you're saying, did Tolkien make this mistake about Edith? I mean, he spends his life thinking of her as Luthien. They'd known each other for 5 years before they'd known each other as children, young adolescent, 16. Edith was 3 years older than Ronald, and they'd known each other for a few years, and then she'd gone off, and then he's 21, and they get married and so forth. So they marry young, although it was an appropriate age, considered an appropriate age in their time. Is Tolkien saying, I did this to your mother. I projected onto her all of my longings, and it was a big mistake? Or or did he know this already at the beginning? It's kind of hard to tell, right? Because obviously Tolkien's writing this 25 years on, right? Well, next paragraph. Women really have not much part in all of this, though they may use the language of romantic love since it is so entwined in all our idioms. Now that was, I guess that's not what you were expecting. I mean, he's basically saying women aren't terrifically romantic, right? Which is, if you want to talk about, counter to stereotype, I don't know about the stereotype of, women read the romance novels, right? Or I don't, so I'm a terrible example of the ordinary woman reader, right? I have read some romance novels in my life, but I don't read the Harlequins and the Mills and Boone and things like that. Although, as I understand it, I did once sort of look up, it's like you can make a good career as a romance novelist, and some of the best ones that write for Harlequin, they write 2 or 3 a year, right? I'm like, wow, okay, how many times can you tell the same story? Which is basically my perception of it, right? There's one romance and you're telling it over and over and over again. And Tolkien here is simply saying, women don't talk about this, although they may use the language of romantic love. They're actually much more down to earth. The sexual impulse makes women, naturally when unspoiled, more unselfish, very sympathetic and understanding, or especially desirous of being so or seeming so. Okay, skin cracks are showing here. And very ready to enter into all the interests as far as they can, from ties to religion, of the young man they are attracted to. Aha! Right? And here we get to, I always wonder whether, Milo and Owen and Vox have read Tolkien's letter here, right? It's like he's basically saying they're malleable. That they will, because of their desire, the sexual impulse makes them desirous to, as he's bluntly saying, enter into all the interests as far as they can, from ties to religion. Now, in fact, Edith, she did convert to Catholicism, but it took her a year. She did break off her engagement that she was in when Ronald shows up, right after his 21st birthday. But once it became clear that he wanted to marry her, but she had to convert, she it does seem she drug her heels to a certain extent, right? Although maybe it just took a year to, be catechized and received. But it was bitter for her and fairly hard. She got thrown out of her boarding house to convert, and to convert to Catholicism in the early 20th century in England was to accept a degree of social ostracism. So she did do it, and he's saying, is there some acknowledgement that she is missing out on the other kinds of things that he would be attached to? I mean, having been a woman for all my life, and remembering how, indeed, when I was younger, very, very willing to take up the interests of the men that I was, attached to, or attracted to. And then, once you're in a longer term relationship, you're not actually as interested as you were in his interests necessarily. Once the family is established. So I don't know that we're tricking, we're entering into the trickery here, but it's certainly it's a feature. Which he says, no intent necessarily to deceive, sheer instinct. The servient helpmeet instinct, generously warmed by desire and young blood. Under this impulse, here's the bit where the women students always get really upset. Under this impulse, they can in fact often achieve very remarkable insight and understanding, even of things outside their natural range, for it is their gift to be receptive, stimulated, fertilized, in many other manners than the physical, by the male. Oh, well, we just lost all the women. I mean, he's basically saying, yeah, women, women are perfectly capable of, understanding, which is, nice to hear. I mean, he is a professor, and if we go back to the list of students that we had in his advising, Tolkien actually, remember this is Tolkien's library, had a fair number of women students. I'm just reading off from the people that he advised. Joan Blomfeld, 1935, Somerville College. Cam Briggs, which looks like could have been a woman, not sure. Ursula Mary Brown, later Dronka, Somerville. So Somerville's a women's college, so that makes sense. Around 1949, Mary Elizabeth Carroll, St. Hilda College, somewhere around 1933. They have mainly these. Ruth A. Crook, 1929. Lucia Glanville. They're all at Somerville, 1958. He has a fair number of formal students who are women, right? So when he's writing to Michael and saying, they can achieve understanding and insight, it's not that he didn't think women were teachable. Unfortunately, that's kind of exactly what he did think, right? Every teacher knows that. How quickly an intelligent woman can be taught, grasp his ideas, see his point, and how, with rare exceptions, they can go no further when they leave his hand or when they cease to take a personal interest in him. Okay, now we've just here is Tolkien's, misogyny right out. I mean, is he wrong, right? No, I don't think he is. I think he's actually accurate that women are best. I mean, you could say we're best at thriving in a personal relationship, in relation to someone that we have in conversation. And I mean, what's interesting is, for example, some of the greatest women in the Christian tradition have they've been famous for their relationship with men. You can say Mary Magdalene. We'll start with that. But people like Saint Clare and Saint Francis, or Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint John of the Cross, that we can say Elizabeth of Schönau and her brother Hildegard of Bingen had her male secretaries and confidants whom she spoke with. I'm trying to think of some more famous ones. Sor Maria de Agreda and Philip, King Philip the Fourth, that women in correspondence with men, it's say which is the smarter, Teresa of Avila or St. John of the Cross. You can often see very, very intelligent women in close intellectual, getting close to us. Are we talking about friendship here? Relationships with men. What Tolkien is, so he's not saying that they can't do intelligent work, right? But that they only go so far as they do when the personal interest is sustained, right? And whether he's speaking here from actual experience as a professor advising students, or his daughter's still pretty young at this stage, and you say what exactly does he understand about that? But he's not saying this in a he's not meaning it. And this is a personal letter that he's writing to his son, so it's like under conditions of some extremity in terms of the argument that he wants to make to Michael, considering that this is just raw dad experience, take for what that's worth. He is trying to be compassionate on all levels, which is, I think, important to remember here. And he's saying this is the way they love, right? He says, but this is their, women's, natural avenue to love, because the young woman knows where she is. And while the romantic young man, when he exists, is still sighing, she may actually fall in love, which for her, an unspoiled natural young woman, means that she wants to become the mother of the young man's children, even if that desire is by no means clear to her or explicit. So as far as Tolkien is concerned, the falling in love means she wants to have children. And I'm very compassionate to that understanding, that he's saying what you need to understand is you may not, young man, be in love, but if she is, you have to recognize what she's expecting, right? And there, I think Tolkien is being far more compassionate towards women than any feminist I've read, right? It's like you're not going to get around. You're not going to get around the longing that women have for. Now I've got this hair in my I feel awkward. This longing that women have for children, right? And then things are going to happen, which is what in fact he's really trying to warn Michael against. And they may be very painful and harmful if things go wrong. Here's where he's actually most worried. Don't think that you're sort of dreaming of this high romantic relationship. Don't think that she's going to experience it the same way, because she's not. Particularly, and this is where he's he's hardest. He's worried that Michael has fallen in love with this muse, right? This star, this goddess, right? Particularly if the young man only wanted a temporary guiding star and divinity until he hitches his wagon to a brighter one, and was merely enjoying the flattery of sympathy nicely seasoned with the titillation of sex, all quite innocent, of course, and worlds away from seduction. This is what that Tolkien is very, very worried about, that Michael has made a fantasy that he's fallen in love with, and what he actually is, in the person he's in relationship with, is a real human being. And she has her own purposes as a woman that are not wrong for her to have, right? And therefore I do think Tolkien is onto something. Now he says, you may meet in life as in literature. There's an interesting footnote here on literature, but you may meet in life as in literature women who are flighty or even plain wanton. And he says, literature is basically masculine, and in it there's a great deal about the fair and false. He says that is on the whole a slander. Women are humans and therefore capable of perfidy, but within the human family, as contrasted with men, they are not generally or naturally the more perfidious. Very much the reverse. Except only that women are apt to break down if asked to wait for a man too long, and while youth, so precious and necessary to a would-be mother, is swiftly passing, they should in fact not be asked to wait. I'm going to start crying again, right? Can you imagine this? Here Tolkien is saying, don't make her wait, right? Now that, to me, it's like, it's what Tolkien, in effect, Tolkien did not make Edith wait. His guardian said that they had to cut off relationships with each other. And when Tolkien wrote to her, she was engaged to be married, and he says he wouldn't have blamed her if she hadn't broken off that engagement, but that as far as Tolkien was concerned, it's horrible. And consider here too that he's writing this in wartime, right? It's 1941, and telling Michael, don't expect it's wrong of you to make some attachment with this poor woman. Tell her, wait for me, and then leave her stranded. Whether he ends up, going back into the field and dying or something, which is very hard on Edith when Ronald was at the Somme. They apparently arranged a sort of code so they could write to her and give her some idea where they were as troops. But that Tolkien is very specifically saying women are not naturally more perfidious. Men are, right? Men lie and break faith, and what he's trying to make sure, I think, Michael doesn't do is make a promise to this woman and then break, not follow through. She is, it's interesting saying, the false women of literature are not real. And it's interesting saying that women are not naturally wanton, saying literally the reverse, saying they're not all whores. In fact, quite the reverse. It's not, and he says, I don't refer to mere flirtatiousness, the sparring practice for the real combat, but to women who are too silly to take even love seriously, or actually so depraved as to enjoy conquests. At least in 1941, as far as Tolkien was concerned. And remember, he is teaching women students, so he is, surrounded by women of a marriageable age, as you would say. And as far as he's concerned, they're not, vamps, right? On the whole, they're not out there to enjoy conquest or even to enjoy the giving of pain. They're therefore not dominatrixes. But these are abnormalities, even though false teaching, bad upbringing, and corrupt fashions may encourage them. Well, now can't you just love him, right? He sees women as longing for children, inclined to want to take on all of the interest of the young men while they're falling in love with him. But what they really, really want, and saying this is what Edith and he go on to have, is the children and grandchildren. I'm delighted to know one of their grandchildren is named Rachel, and her birthday is the day after mine, so she's born 6 years after me. But anyway, they have many grandchildren, and if what happened in their marriage was happy in those respects, then Humphrey Carpenter is just wrong, right? Edith, there are also stories not in Carpenter about how delightful it was hanging out with Tolkien and Edith and hearing them talk about the children. So this much more Sam at home with Rosie character than Sam off in Mordor, servant to Frodo. That Tolkien was able to have the relationship with Edith that he seems to be saying, Michael, you need to understand this. You may have this impression that she's going to be engaged in all these high intellectual arguments with you and enjoy that, but what she's really wanting is children. So don't misunderstand this. He says, much though modern conditions have changed feminine circumstances in the detail of what is considered propriety sexually, right? They have not changed natural instinct. Okay, and here is where we're saying, modern women are just like, well, maybe they aren't anymore. Saying, I don't want children, I want a career. And he's saying, a man has a life work, a career, and male friends, all of which could and do, where he has any guts, survive the shipwreck of love. What the love is the desire for children, right? Which, what we're saying is, again, I've been trying to make this point over the last few episodes. The problem of the elves for Tolkien is going to be the problem both of art and children, and the relations between men and women, but also the relations between the desire for immortality and death. But the sort of deep, sort of core idealization that he projects into his Elvis relationships is on how they have children, what goes into their having children. He says, a young woman, even one, quote, economically independent, as they say now, it usually really means economic subservience to male commercial employers instead of to a father or family. Ding! All right, he gets it, right? Oh, yeah, fine. You're feminism has made you so free. You're the slave of your employer, your wage slave of your employer, rather than queen in your own house. Y'all are gonna, I hope to see memes about Tolkien after this episode. Begins to think of the bottom drawer and dream of a home almost at once. Women want a home, and they and no matter how economically, quote, independent they are, they're going to want that. And it's interesting. It's like you can think of this. What's so interesting is every generation, for who knows how long, it feels like 200 years, 300 years, women are saying, our mothers were kept in the homes. It's like, well, yeah, you had a mother, and she kept you in the home because that's where you have children, right? If you didn't have mothers being kept in the home, you wouldn't exist. And then the daughters come along and they say, oh, we want careers. And Dorothy Sayers has some wonderful female characters in things like Murder Must Advertise, where there's career women and working in the advertising agency and so forth. And it was totally a feature of the 20s and 30s that women had careers, right? And Tolkien would have known some of them. Some of them go off to become Oxford Dons. And Dorothy Sayers also does the famous novel Gaudy Night, where she's showing the in a woman's college, the tension between the Dons, the women who are there not having families, which was the custom at that point, versus the men who can have families and therefore need to support them, and the tensions that arise around that claim. But what Tolkien's pointing Michael to now is saying she's going to want a family and she's going to want a home. If she really falls in love, the shipwreck may really end on the rocks. Anyway, women are in general much less romantic and more practical. Don't be misled by the fact that they are more sentimental in words, freer with darling and all that. They do not want a guiding star. Now here I'm not quite sure what he's saying. You as the young man, staring up into the heavens, writing love poetry to your beloved. I think the converse is women obviously we can be unintentionally enormously cruel when having been picked, chosen by a young man, and yes, so I do have that experience, and it was a difficult one, right? Having been chosen by the young man as the object of his attention, and gifts, to say no to him just feels, astonishingly and horribly cruel, which is, from my perspective as a woman, where a lot of the lady who's fair and false comes from. And in fact, what Tolkien is trying to warn Michael against, right? Saying, don't take her as this guiding star. It's not her that's going to be false, right? It's your fantasizing about what she is. Don't be misled by the fact they're more sentimental in words, freer with darling and all that. They do not want a guiding star. And consider that Tolkien's also, Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex comes out around this time. I think it's 1943. All my things that I'm doing off the top of my head, terrible. Anyway, it's not really like there's no discussion of feminism in the air when Tolkien's writing. That Alexander Kollontai has been writing about free love since the 20s. And, before that, communists have a early flirtation with these ideals of free love and so forth. That he is sorry, I forgot where I was going with that. The women don't want a guiding star. I think what he is saying is that they fling themselves into a young man's relationships, sort of drifting off into thinking about Alexander Kollontai. I think of Reds, right? Who was in that? Diane Keaton and guy, right? And she projects all of her Warren Beatty, all of her sort of political. This often happens in these. That's what I was thinking. It happens in these political movements, right? That the women get, sort of caught up in the work and project, they form these attachments with the men whose work they share, and of course all I want is the work. But Tolkien's saying that's they don't want that. What they want is a home and the children. But that doesn't mean there aren't traps for them. They may idealize a plain young man into a hero. It's interesting. He doesn't, say they go for the dangerous, bad boys, right? Maybe we always kind of have. I kind of need to read Wuthering Heights and find out what Heathcliff is up to. But women might take a young man and lift him up in their imagination to be more than he is. But they don't really need any such glamour, either to fall in love or to remain in it. I say this would be saying, maybe we're not all going for the alphas and the betas, and maybe we actually like the deltas. Never mind the gammas. It's funny. I mean, the only obvious gamma I can think of is Wormtongue. It's so obvious that's a problem. But anyway, if they have any delusion, it is that they can reform men, right? And they're, yes, the sort of bad boy character. If the women's flaw is believing they can take someone who is not, developing himself and fix him, which is a problem. They will take a rotter open-eyed, and even when the delusion of reforming him fails, go on loving him. Okay, so he does say they take bad men. I'm being silly, right? Rotter plain men. Heathcliff is on stage, right? They are, of course, much more realistic about the sexual relation. Unless perverted by bad contemporary fashions, they do not, as a rule, talk body. That's interesting to me that he doesn't. He's. I wonder what he would think about modern idiom now. I often wonder whether the women really enjoy it. It's the degree to which, I've been known to use the it's not Anglo-Saxon actually. Fuch is Middle English, but as far as he's concerned, women don't actually like the body banter talk, right? Not because they are purer than men, they are not, but because they don't find it funny. And there, I do think he's accurate in the way women and men behave differently. For example, in social media, women not really liking a lot of the strong push back and forth that the men engage in. I have known those who pretended to, but it's a pretense. It may be intriguing, interesting, absorbing, even a great deal too absorbing to them, but it's just plumb natural, a serious, obvious interest. Where's the joke? I guess. So he's saying, they may get curious, but they're not really, they're not. Now I've got my cat meowing in the background. Where's the joke? So basically what he's trying to do is dispel a lot of illusions for Michael, to the point where he's saying, you're dealing with a real human being, and I need you to understand women on their own terms, which, as Tolkien understands it, is very practical. They have, of course, still to be more careful in sexual relations for all the contraceptives. This is pre-pill, it's 1941, but there are contraceptives already available. Mistakes are damaging physically and socially and matrimonially. But they are instinctively, when uncorrupt, monogamous. Men are not. Oh! Now, I don't know. Okay, no, you're going to find out that no, Tolkien is not about to confess how many times he cheated on his wife. But there is this is an interesting thing to be telling his son. Men are not naturally monogamous. No good pretending men just ain't. Not by their animal nature. Monogamy, and he is saying, so women are naturally monogamous. But that doesn't make them romantic in the way the men are, who like finding guiding stars and muses and can be flighty about that, right? But there's also the problem of men, naturally, biologically can make a lot of kids. Monogamy, although it's long been fundamental to our inherited ideas, is for us men a piece of revealed ethic, according to faith and not to the flesh. Each of us could healthily beget in our 30-odd years of full manhood a few hundred children and enjoy the process. Brigham Young, I believe, was a healthy and happy man. It is a fallen world, and there is no consonance between our bodies, minds, and souls. That is, now, remember that when I get to the elves and what he imagines about the elves, because he does imagine the elves are naturally monogamous, which was very, very interesting, right? Because in his sort of frankness with his son, he's going to insist, monogamy is our ideal, and he's not going to say it's not a good ideal. It is important, but he's just going to say it's hard because we're fallen, and there is no harmony no consonance between our bodies, minds, and souls. However, and this is we're now to sort of the big one, right? Here's the real ideal that he wants to bring Michael to in his understanding. However, the essence of a fallen world is that the best cannot be attained by free enjoyment, or by what is called self-realization, usually a nice name for self-indulgence, wholly inimical to the realization of other selves, but by denial, by suffering. Remember, he said earlier that the religion was hard and bitter, right? Well, he's not expecting to try to get out of it at all. Faithfulness in Christian marriage entails that great mortification. Okay, well, is he trying to talk Michael out of marriage or into marriage? It's so interesting that Michael and Joan went ahead and got married after getting this letter, right? I do think they got the letter. It's what I don't understand in the there's not a note saying whether or not he has just drafted and sent it. Faithfulness in Christian marriage entails that great mortification. For a Christian man, there is no escape. If you get married, you're stuck, right? You're not going to be able to get divorced. And as far as Tolkien's concerned, this is a good thing, but it's not going to be easy. Marriage may help to sanctify and direct to its proper object his sexual desires. Its grace may help him in the struggle, but the struggle remains. It will not satisfy him, as hunger may be kept off by regular meals. It will offer as many difficulties to the purity proper to that state as it provides easements. No man, however truly he loved his betrothed and bride as a young man, has lived faithful to her as a wife in mind and body, without deliberate conscious exercise of the will, without self-denial. My cat is going to keep doing that, isn't she? I'm going to do something I've never done, and I'm going to have to leave the video for just a second. Back. We've been giving her better food, and she is most insistent. Any case, no man, however true, and she's not fasting, even though this is Holy Week as I'm recording, not yet Easter, right? No man, however truly he loved his betrothed and bride as a young man, has lived faithful to her as wife in mind and body, without deliberate conscious exercise of the will, without self-denial. Too few are told that, even those brought up in the church. Those outside seem seldom to have heard it. When the glamour wears off, or merely works a bit thin, they think they have made a mistake, and that the real soulmate is still to find. Oh, wait a minute, another turn, right? So the problem here is, yes, Christian marriage means it's going to be hard, it's going to be difficult, it's never going to be something that you achieve without denial and suffering, but it's also the only real way that you find your soulmate. The real soulmate too often proves to be the next sexually attractive person that comes along, in the modern idiom, right? It's like, oh, we've gotten in love, in this sort of faux romanticism, right? I found my soulmate, let's get married. Oh no, the next one, now I've fallen out of love with you. The glamour is worn off, and here we are. I need to find my next soulmate. Someone whom they might indeed very profitably have married, if only, hence divorce, to provide the if only. And of course they are, as a rule, quite right. They did make a mistake. Oh ho! Only a very wise man, at the end of his life, could make a sound judgment concerning whom, amongst the total possible chances, he ought most profitably to have married. That's the mistake, right? Nearly all marriages, even happy ones, are mistakes. Now, at this point, it's like, you could say, okay, is he trying to talk Michael into or out of marriage? It's rather difficult to tell, because in the sense that almost certainly in a more perfect world, or even with a little more care in this very imperfect one, both partners might have found more suitable mates. And then here is my absolute favorite line in the whole letter. But the real soulmate is the one you are actually married to. Right? This is Now Tolkien has come to the sense that of marriage as sacrament, right? Your true soulmate is the one that you're married to. You really do very little choosing. Life and circumstances do most of it, though if there is a God, these must be his instruments or his appearances. It is notorious that in fact happy marriages are more common where the choosing by the young persons is even more limited by parental or family authority, as long as there is a social ethic of plain unromantic responsibility and conjugal fidelity. That arranged marriages tend to be happier, and he would be saying, I think, because you recognize the journey, the difficulty, the suffering. He doesn't say journey, right? In fact, he doesn't set it up as journey in those terms at all. It's simply your true soulmate is the one you're married to, and that is what you learn to be, is your soulmates. But even in countries where the romantic tradition has so far affected social arrangements as to make people believe that the choosing of a mate is solely the concern of the young, only the rarest good fortune brings together the man and the woman who are really, as it were, destined for one another and capable of very great and splendid love. The idea still dazzles us, catches us by the throat. Poems and stories in multitudes have been written on the theme, more probably than the total of such loves in real life, right? There's more versions of, there's certainly more Harlequin romances and I don't know than any other genre, right? It's like you can turn these out quite quickly, and they could tell them over and over and over again. The great romantic meeting. We all wish that we could be in that story. Guess what? Most people aren't, and the true story, the one that we're actually in this fallen world, is your soulmate is the one that you're married to. So when you get married, what you are promising to do is be soulmates to each other regardless of where it takes you, right? And he says, yet the greatest of these tales do not tell of the happy marriage of such great lovers, but of their tragic separation, as if even in this sphere, the truly great and splendid in this fallen world is more nearly achieved by failure and suffering. In such great inevitable love, often love at first sight, we catch a vision, I suppose, of marriage as it should have been in an unfallen world. In this fallen world, we have as our only guides prudence, wisdom, which is rare in youth, too late in age, a clean heart, and fidelity of will. Well, to me, this gets us to this incredible, 4 pages of, better advice than most people get on marriage ever, of an understanding of the propensities that women and men have. That women, I as a young woman, what your experiences, you're projecting your love onto, these fantasy guys, and the men that are interested in you are not the ones that you're interested in. This disconnect and so forth. And finally, when you find two of you that are apparently interested in each other, it's what Tolkien is saying is it's still potentially at odds with your expectations, right? He may be seeing one thing, she may be seeing this other thing, which he's saying to Michael she probably definitely is, because she wants children and a home. However much she may say she doesn't, that's what she's going to want. And if she falls in love, never mind that intellectual engagement that you wish you could have with, we share so much. It's like he's saying she's thinking of children. She wants children, and you need to be willing to promise with an exercise of will to stay with her through all of that. Well, he concludes, or he spends another couple pages giving the story of how I met your mother and how we fell in love, and how in fact hard it was. He does insist that she was under no vow to me, so he is setting himself up as an example here. I'm like, I did live by what I'm trying to argue for you here. Don't make her make a promise to you when she's young and needs to be able to consider making a family, right? The footnote about literature, women are apt to break down if asked to wait, right? She may in fact break faith with you, be perfidious if you force her to hold off having children, because that is hard on women, as we know, right? You can't be any age and still find conceiving easy, and Tolkien's just being quite blunt about it. Don't make her wait. And he's saying, I didn't really make your mother wait. She was under no obligation to me, but we did come together, and think of your mother. Yet I do not now for a moment feel that she was doing more than she should have been asked to do. Not that that detracts from the credit of it. I was a young fellow. I had no, money. She married me in 1916, and John was born in 1917. Conceived and carried during the starvation year of 1917, the Great U-Boat Campaign, round about the Battle of Cambrai, when the end of the war seemed as far off as it does now. Blah, blah, blah. That I get it. He's basically saying to Michael, I get it. He's like, you want to get married now, and yet you're still in the middle of this very difficult situation. At no point in the letter does he say, don't marry her because she's just your nurse. But he's worried for both of them that Michael is going to not be able to give Joan what she needs as a woman. But to recognize that once they're married, they're bound, right? And the sort of don't be thinking that you're going to find the soulmate, in any other way. It's just not going to happen. This is a fallen world, and so this over and over and over again, trying simply to be very, very practical. But it's like suddenly out of the blue, and apparently in weird ways at odds with everything that he's been saying for the whole in the main part of the letter. He sort of bursts out with this love song, but it's not to Edith. It's not to his wife. Out of the darkness of my life, so much frustrated, I put before you the one great thing to love on earth, the Blessed Sacrament. I mean, the Eucharist, the Mass, right? And for everyone who does not take Tolkien's Catholicism seriously, consider that in this incredibly personal letter, trying, to make sure that his son makes a good decision, the most important decision that he's making in his life, and that what Tolkien points to at the end is in fact the host, right? The Blessed Sacrament, the Mass. I think it's the whole thing, right? He understands the whole of the Mass, for which, he would have put off marrying Michael's mother, because Edith, he wouldn't have married Edith unless she was able to be, sacramentally in communion with him. They in fact were married in Lent, so they didn't have a Mass until later in their marriage. They were married on March 22nd, but Edith and Ronald. But for Tolkien, it's like, okay, if you need something to like project all of your fantasies onto, on your desire and your longing, you need the star that's going to guide you. It's the Blessed Sacrament. There you will find romance, glory, honor, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves upon earth, and more than that, death. By the divine paradox, that which ends life and demands the surrender of all, and yet by the taste or foretaste of which alone can what you seek in your earthly relationships, love, faithfulness, joy, be maintained, or take on that complexion of reality, of eternal endurance, which every man's heart desires. Oh, and then he writes to Michael later in June. But when I was looking up my notes, there's another letter soon after in March that Carpenter doesn't, or maybe it's this short one about the name. I don't know. Anyway, wow, boom, right? It's like we've been talking about the relationship between men and women, the fallen world, the don't take her as your star, and then here, offered to Michael at the end. And in fact, probably the thing that was, in fact, most difficult for Edith all along. It's not the men friendships. It seems that they had a very happy home life. Certainly, Tolkien, who spends the kids' childhood writing kids' books for them, Roverandom, and doing the fabulous Mur Palace in the picture there, or the great Father Christmas letters. Tolkien must have been a pretty fun dad. I hope he was. I mean, if you're gonna do bear pictures, here's the polar bear, the polar bear flinging demons put that up a bit closer. Dad, that's 1933, 10 years later. Let's see if he's still drawing them for Priscilla. 1941, 42. Woohoo! Look at that. Polar bear dancing with the penguins. I think he was a pretty fun and delightful dad. So the thing that he loved most, and that he says focus on, it's the only way, it's the only true guiding star out of all of this complexity as men and women, is in fact the Blessed Sacrament, is in fact the Eucharist. And if you think about, say, I've been building you all up to this continuously, right? But basically that paragraph for all of these videos, thinking of, what was Tolkien's true guiding star throughout his life. Well, I think maybe he wasn't always perfect in his attendance at Mass, right? But what he points Michael to most intimately is, in fact, the host, the great shining star, the monstrance that I was talking about when I was talking about the jewels, right? And this blazing image of God's intervention, God's entering into his creation. Well, that's all I think important background to both what Tolkien does with his elves, and as we keep going with the meaning of the Silmarils, right? Understanding that the story of the elves is the story of the Silmarils and the story of these great living gemstones. If it all comes down to this desire to understand, the source of true love in our lives, I'm pretty willing to take Tolkien as a guide. Thank you for joining me. We will carry on with elves some more next time, to be continued. Oh, and the cat's fine. She's fine. I'll go get her and feed her now.